Imagine yourself inside a giant stone castle. The interior is even colder than the outside. There's a deadly frost beyond the walls, and inside the icy air stings your lungs with every breath you take. With every exhale, you feel the cold sinking into your very bones. Even the thickest stone walls cannot stop this cold. Wooden doors, tiny windows, cracks within the walls. This is not a scene taken from a beloved and glamorous medieval movie. This was a harsh reality that people faced for centuries during the Middle Ages. Today we see castles as magnificent and impressive structures, but in reality they were cold, dark, and gloomy places. Now let's take a closer look at what medieval people had to do to stay alive and not freeze in these massive stone structures. Castles in the Middle Ages were built for survival. They were surrounded by massive stone walls to protect the people inside from raids and attacks. These walls had to be constructed from large, solid stone blocks so that they could withstand siege weapons. But those durable walls had one major disadvantage. Dense stone absorbed the cold from outside extremely quickly, and because it trapped this cold for a long time, castle walls essentially became enormous refrigerators. This icy stone armor was a major problem for everyone living inside. It was nearly impossible to heat the high-ceilinged great halls built for ceremonies and feasts. Warm air rose and easily escaped through cracks near the ceiling or gaps between the stones. To ventilate smoke from kitchens and large hearths, wide chimneys and openings were made. These openings pulled cold air inside while letting warm air escape, creating a constant airflow that made heating the interior even more difficult. The architecture of castles created challenges on its own. Heavy stone arches and floors not only absorbed cold, they continuously radiated it into the living spaces. The ground was especially freezing because it was in direct contact with the soil. Cold seeped upward from the floor, and even thick boots could not fully protect against it. Footwear of the time was simple and poorly insulated, making standing on stone floors even more unbearable. Most castles were built on high hills. This was advantageous for defense, but it also left them exposed to the wind. Strong winds would slip through narrow arrow slits and door gaps, creating inescapable drafts of cold air. In winter, the air inside the castle could become so cold that even breathing felt heavy and painful. Under these conditions, even the simplest daily tasks became nearly unbearable. Building techniques of the time were also limited. The mortar that held the stones together gradually crumbled, creating small gaps in the walls. These tiny openings allowed cold air to leak inside. The air passed through the walls, chilling living spaces even further. Castle windows were small, had no glass, and were often covered with wooden shutters, but these shutters could not block the cold from outside. Winter days inside a castle were dark and gloomy. Because light only entered through narrow slits and tiny windows, the interior remained in constant semi-darkness. Living under such conditions required incredible endurance. Every day and every night was a struggle. People constantly searched for ways to resist the brutality of nature. Living in a castle during winter meant facing the cold at every moment. People ate, talked, and worked without taking off their outer garments. Bathtubs filled with hot water were an extreme luxury, available only to wealthy nobles. Even cleaning was done in icy cold rooms, making life even more unbearable. Every moment of life, from waking up to eating meals to completing daily tasks, was spent trying to find some way to stay warm. Now pause for a moment and think. If you were faced with such cold, how would you keep warm? Write in the comments, could you really survive in the Middle Ages? Open hearths were both dangerous and inefficient. A fire burning in the center of a room was nowhere near enough to heat the entire space, and thick smoke spread everywhere. Even with roof openings, smoke clung to walls and furniture, leaving a permanent smell and a layer of soot. Breathing this air for long periods made it difficult for people to even inhale properly. For these reasons, wall-mounted fireplaces began to be built over time. Because smoke exited through a chimney, they were safer, but they still had limits. Fireplaces could only heat the area directly around them, and massive amounts of wood were required. Entire piles of wood could be consumed in a single day. Transporting, storing, and keeping this wood dry was a major challenge on its own. Because of these limitations, castle inhabitants were forced to live close to the fire. During cold months, life concentrated in 1 or 2 rooms where a fire was burning. This meant almost no personal space and constant crowding. Even the lord of the castle and his family were not truly comfortable in their bedrooms. Those rooms were no warmer than the rest of the castle. The family, servants, and guests all gathered around the fireplace to stay warm. This created many challenges in both daily and social life. Preparing firewood was one of the most important duties in castles. Throughout summer and autumn, people worked non-stop to collect enough fuel for the entire winter. Huge stacks of wood were piled in the castle courtyards. The size of these piles said a lot about the wealth of the castle's lord. Running out of wood early was a true disaster. During a siege or a long snowstorm when no new fuel could be brought in, the castle was at real risk of freezing. So in a world where warmth was not easily found, where it was a luxury to be fought for every single day, what would we give up just to stay in a warm place for a single day? People developed much more creative methods of dealing with the cold than you might imagine. Some of these solutions were surprisingly effective. One of the most creative and effective solutions was using wall tapestries and thick wool curtains. These tightly woven fabrics were hung on walls to create an extra layer of insulation. They not only provided protection against the cold, but also helped keep heat inside small, isolated areas. In bedchambers, curtains were hung around the bed, forming a kind of tent. This way, people did not have to heat the entire room, only the small area around themselves. This room within a room method was crucial for creating minimal comfort. Producing wall tapestries was labor-intensive and expensive. For this reason, such items were also symbols of prestige. The more tapestries on the walls, the warmer and more comfortable the room became. These tapestries divided large halls into smaller sections, making areas for eating, sleeping, and working much more livable. Curtains separated sleeping areas from the rest of the hall, helping body heat accumulate in a small space. In addition to wall tapestries, thick wool blankets and coverings were widely used. They were draped over shoulders and knees, warmed beds, and were placed on the floor to reduce the chill of the stone. Over time, these textile products transformed from mere functional items into works of art. The detailed patterns and historical scenes woven onto them made them culturally valuable pieces, handed down through generations. Interestingly, the use of textiles for insulation continued for centuries, even after more advanced heating systems were introduced. Wall tapestries continued to decorate castles and palaces, though their primary role in fighting cold gradually faded into history. Looking at the history of castles, we see that behind these stone walls lay not only power and authority, but also an endless battle with nature. Unlike open hearths and fireplaces, stoves were far more efficient heating tools. These enclosed structures, made of stone or brick, contained the fire inside them, and heat spread into the room from their warm outer walls. Because smoke exited through a chimney, the air inside remained cleaner. Stoves first appeared in areas with particularly harsh climates, such as modern-day Germany and Scandinavia. But their spread was slow because stoves required more complex designs than simple fireplaces. Chimneys had to be planned carefully and had to fit the existing castle structures, which was not always possible. Alongside major solutions like tapestries and stoves, people used smaller but effective methods too. For example, they placed heated stones or containers of hot water in their beds. This warmed the bed before sleeping and helped people survive the night without freezing. Wool blankets and fur pelts not only provided warmth, but created extra insulation. They were spread on the floor to reduce the cold of the stone, and people wrapped themselves in these furs to stay warm. Fur was especially valuable because it retained heat extremely well. Fox, bear, and sable furs were among the most preferred. Another method was staying together. People spent their evenings in the one large room where a fire was burning. The heat from many bodies warmed the space somewhat. Hot food and drinks warmed people from the inside. For this reason, inns, taverns, and other communal areas were important, not just for socializing, but also as places where the lower classes could warm themselves. On cold winter nights, people often slept in the same room, or even in the same bed. This was especially common among servants, who often slept on the floor of their lord's chamber, acting as a source of warmth. This was not considered disrespectful, just a necessary measure. Historical records clearly show how cold medieval castles could be. Sources from the 14th and 15th centuries describe rivers freezing completely in winter, with heavy wagons crossing over the ice. In many accounts, water left in pitchers inside castle rooms froze solid overnight. This shows that indoor temperatures sometimes dropped below freezing. Inventory lists reveal shocking amounts of wood required to heat castles. Some records show that tens of thousands of pieces of wood were consumed during a single winter. These numbers demonstrate just how difficult it was to keep castles warm. Other documents mention rooms that were heated only during winter. The rest of the castle remained icy cold. Some great halls were so frigid that breathing became difficult. Because glass was rare, windows were covered with thin mica, oiled parchment, or left open entirely. This did not fully block the cold or wind, making life even harder. For this reason, people spent as much time as possible in the kitchen, where large fires burned constantly. The kitchen was one of the warmest parts of the castle, and thanks to constant activity, more livable than other areas. Winter hardships appear clearly in historical letters and diaries. Many of them describe endless colds, joint pain, and unbearable conditions. Cold was not just uncomfortable, it was a serious health threat. Records mention lords returning home and immediately asking for a warm drink or heading straight to the fireplace. In poorer castles, usually only the dining room and the lord's private chambers could be heated. Guest rooms, servants' quarters, and even the armory often remained cold. This was because wood supplies were limited and had to be used carefully throughout winter. Castles were not only military structures, they were also centers of administration and trade. Courts were held here, ambassadors were received, and agreements were made. But all of these important affairs took place under conditions that would be unacceptable to us today. Even during official receptions, halls could be so cold that guests did not remove their cloaks and furs. The cold was like an invisible force, always present in the background of every event inside the castle. Despite these hardships, people did not give up. They kept finding new ways to stay warm. Many of these methods were directly related to clothing. Clothing played a critical role in survival. Contrary to the elegant outfits we see in films, real medieval clothing was coarse and thick. People wore several layers of linen and wool undergarments, and outer clothing was made from heavy, warm fabrics. In winter, fur-lined garments were common. Fur coats and cloaks were essential parts of the medieval wardrobe. Gloves and head coverings were necessary not only outdoors, but even indoors. During official receptions and feasts, halls were often so cold that people kept their heavy cloaks on. Clothing was not a symbol of status, but a necessity for survival. The basic principle was layering. Under outer garments, several layers of linen and wool shirts created an insulating pocket of air. Men wore knee-length or longer tunics. Women wore floor-length dresses. These garments somewhat restricted movement, but offered excellent protection from the cold. Clothing was not only warm, but also durable. Materials were expensive, so garments were well maintained, continually repaired, and passed down through generations. Fur was considered a luxury, not for decoration, but for survival. Fur-lined jackets were worn under cloaks. Fur collars, cuffs, and hems were chosen to trap heat effectively. To protect against the cold of stone floors, people even wore fur socks inside their shoes. Hoods and gloves were indispensable parts of winter attire. Indoors could be so cold that people often kept their hoods on. These were not accessories, but essential layers of protection against the cold leaking in through walls and doors. Gloves kept hands from freezing while writing, working, or sitting near the fireplace. Most clothing being dark-colored was no coincidence. Dark fabrics absorbed sunlight better and heated more quickly. They also concealed dirt more effectively, a practical advantage in a time when clothing was not washed often. Thus medieval fashion was shaped not by aesthetics but by harsh survival conditions. Every garment, from heavy cloaks to fur linings, served a specific purpose. Cold constantly pressed in, and people protected themselves by layering their clothing. Nights in stone castles were the coldest hours of the day. Most fires were extinguished, and the interior temperature dropped dangerously fast. People went to bed wearing multiple layers of clothing, sometimes wrapped directly in furs. The bed was the warmest place in the room. It was usually positioned away from cold stone walls, and the curtains around it created an insulating dome. Preparing for the night was a ritual in itself. People wrapped themselves in several layers of clothing, wore thick wool socks, and covered their heads to retain warmth. Heated stones or containers of hot water, wrapped in cloth, were placed in the bed. These simple tools were vital for enduring the coldest hours. The darkness and cold of the castle created psychological pressure as well. The creaking wind in the walls, the whistling sounds rising from chimneys. These noises amplified feelings of loneliness and vulnerability. For this reason, people often preferred to sleep in groups, which provided both warmth and a sense of safety. Thus, sleeping in a castle became a survival challenge of its own. People used everything available: multiple layers of clothing, thick curtains, heated stones, hot water containers, and of course body heat. These methods helped them endure the darkest and coldest hours of the night, allowing them to continue their struggle for survival among the freezing stone walls when morning came. Fuel was the most critical issue in castles. Wood was the main heat source, but acquiring, transporting, and storing it required enormous effort. Castle managers constantly calculated how much wood would be needed for winter. Wood supplies were treated almost like a strategic resource. In some regions, coal was used alongside wood. Coal produced more heat and burned longer, but it was difficult and dangerous to mine and expensive. So most castles still relied on wood, using coal only in the coldest rooms or for special purposes. From spring until late autumn, people worked tirelessly to secure enough fuel for winter. Woodcutters felling trees, carters transporting logs, laborers stacking large wood piles. These piles were the clearest indicator of how prepared a castle was for winter. In addition to wood and coal, other fuels were used in some areas. Dried animal dung was a cheap and accessible option, though it smelled unpleasant and burned quickly. In castles near rivers and lakes, tree trunks carried by the water were collected and used as fuel. In short, the fuel problem was an endless struggle. People constantly searched for new sources of energy and tried to use existing ones as efficiently as possible. This was an inseparable part of daily life and a constant front in the battle for survival. Over time, architects began to consider heating needs more carefully. Castles were built with smaller rooms and lower ceilings so that heating them became easier. Special furnace rooms appeared, channeling warm air through chimneys built inside the walls to other areas. Doors were thickened and designed to fit their frames more tightly. While castles were once seen primarily as military structures, they gradually transformed into residences where the living conditions of inhabitants mattered. Architects now considered not only defense but also the needs of the people inside. The shape and size of windows changed. Larger windows were built with thick glass and heavy shutters. Because glass was expensive, it was mostly found in the richest castles, while modest castles continued to use small openings and wooden shutters. Thick curtains were used at the entrances of some great halls, forming a sort of vestibule. This prevented cold air from rushing in whenever the door opened. Rooms kept warm continuously also appeared. People warmed themselves there before entering colder areas. Of course, these architectural innovations did not appear overnight. They emerged from centuries of accumulated painful experience. As a result, castles gradually transformed from dark, freezing structures into somewhat more livable spaces. Even so, living in a castle during winter was still difficult, and people continued to use the small tricks passed down from earlier centuries. Your support means the world to us. To stay with us in our upcoming stories, how about joining our journey and becoming a part of our channel by subscribing?